The Virginia sun, a drowsy eye in the hazy afternoon sky, warmed the back of Darius's neck as he wrestled with a stubborn piece of wire fencing. Sweat beaded on his forehead, itching faintly. He squinted, the metal glinting sharply. Almost there, he thought, his fingers working deftly, a familiar comfort in the physical task. The rhythmic clang of the hammer against the staples had a meditative quality, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony of his recent deployment. Back home in Roanoke, the quiet was both a blessing and a curse. It allowed the ghosts to whisper, their voices amplified in the emptiness. He pushed them back, focusing on the task at hand, helping Mrs. Garner mend her fence. Mrs. Garner, a tiny woman with a spine of steel and a heart as big as the Virginia sky, perched on her porch swing, a glass of iced tea sweating on the table beside her. He could hear the gentle creak of the swing, a rhythmic counterpoint to his hammering. "Almost done, Mrs. Garner," he called out, his voice rough from disuse. The quiet had a way of swallowing words, making even the most mundane conversation feel like an intrusion. "Take your time, Darius," she replied, her voice a soft melody against the backdrop of cicadas buzzing in the late summer heat. He could hear the faint clinking of ice in her glass. He appreciated her patience. Patience wasn't something he'd encountered much lately. Not in the heat of battle, not in the sterile confines of the VA hospital, and certainly not from the stares he'd been attracting since he'd returned. Stares that lingered a little too long, filled with a mixture of awe and suspicion. He was used to the awe. The suspicion, however, was new and unsettling. A sudden flicker of movement at the edge of his vision caught his attention. A glint of chrome. Not one, but several. He turned, his hands still gripping the hammer, a knot tightening in his gut. 5 police cruisers, lights flashing, were parked haphazardly along the curb, their presence a jarring intrusion into the quiet afternoon. Officers were spilling out, their hands hovering near their holsters, their faces grim. Darius felt a chill crawl up his spine, a primal fear gripping him despite the absurdity of the situation. What is going on? He thought, his mind racing. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was simply fixing a fence. "Put your hands where I can see them," a voice barked, amplified by a bullhorn. The command echoed in the stillness, shattering the peace. Darius felt his muscles tense, his grip tightening on the hammer. He slowly turned, his eyes scanning the officers, searching for a flicker of recognition, a hint of understanding. He found none, only suspicion and fear. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. "This is ridiculous," he thought, his mind reeling. "I'm a Marine, for God's sake." He slowly lowered the hammer, placing it carefully on the ground. He raised his hands, palms open, a gesture of surrender. "I'm reaching into my back pocket slowly," he announced, his voice strained, each word carefully enunciated. "My it is in my wallet." He reached into his pocket, his movements deliberate, agonizingly slow. "My name is Darius Coltrane. I'm a Marine." "Drop whatever's in your hands," another officer yelled, his voice tight with tension. Darius's mind raced, a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He held up his wallet, its leather worn and familiar. "This is my ID," he said, his voice trembling slightly. He felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, battling with a rising tide of fear. He wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice, but he knew better. He'd seen what happened to those who raged, especially those who looked like him. He was forced to his knees, the rough asphalt scraping against his skin. The cold steel of handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the sound echoing in his ears like a gunshot. He felt a wave of humiliation wash over him, hot and stinging. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not to him. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to quell the rising panic. He could hear Mrs. Garner's voice, a faint protest in the background, but it was swallowed by the cacophony of police radios and barked commands. The officers began searching his truck, their movements rough, their faces impassive. He watched them, his mind numb, as they pulled out his tools, his toolbox, his fishing gear. He could feel the weight of their gazes, heavy with suspicion. He knew what they were looking for. A weapon. proof, anything to justify their actions. They found nothing. Only the tools of a man trying to rebuild his life, piece by piece, after the ravages of war. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken accusations, heavy with the weight of prejudice. Darius remained on his knees, the handcuffs digging into his wrists, a physical manifestation of the invisible chains that bound him. He looked up at the sky, the hazy sun now obscured by clouds. The quiet returned, but it was a different kind of quiet now. A quiet pregnant with unspoken truths, heavy with the weight of a history he hadn't asked for, a history that had led him to this moment, handcuffed on his own street, a stranger in his own land. He closed his eyes. The image of the American flag he'd sworn to protect burned into his mind, a bitter irony in the face of this injustice. The muted gray light of a Wednesday morning filtered through the blinds, slicing across Darius's face. He lay still, eyes closed, the imprint of the cheap mattress ticking against his cheek. The world outside pressed in, a low hum of traffic and distant sirens, a world he desperately wanted to keep at bay. His phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand, a persistent insect he refused to acknowledge. Each vibration felt like a physical jolt, a reminder of the raw shame that clung to him like a second skin. He had replayed the scene 100 times since it happened, the flashing lights, the cold steel of the handcuffs, the bewildered stares of his neighbors. Each replay etched the humiliation deeper, the absurdity of it a bitter pill he couldn't swallow. Just another day in America, a cynical voice whispered in the back of his mind. He rolled over, burying his face in the pillow, the scent of stale sweat and faint detergent a small, familiar comfort. He hadn't slept well, the adrenaline from a night before still coursing through his veins, a restless energy that had no outlet. He finally forced himself to sit up, the room swaying slightly. His body ached, a dull throb in his shoulders and neck, a testament to the rough handling he'd endured. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, the worn carpet scratching against his bare feet. The air in the small apartment felt heavy, stagnant. He needed coffee, something strong enough to kickstart his brain and chase away the lingering shadows. He shuffled towards the kitchen, the familiar creak of the floorboards a small, reassuring sound in the otherwise oppressive silence. The coffee machine sputtered to life, its rhythmic gurgling a welcome distraction. He stared out the window, at the quiet street, at the normalcy of it all. It was as if last night hadn't happened, as if he hadn't been unjustly accused, humiliated, stripped of his dignity in front of his neighbors. The disconnect between the mundane morning and the raw, visceral memory made his stomach churn. He closed his eyes, willing the image away. His phone buzzed again, the persistent vibration a tangible irritant. He finally reached for it, the cool glass a stark contrast to the heat that was building inside him. Missed calls, texts, voicemails. He scrolled through the list, a knot tightening in his chest. Names he recognized, friends from his unit, family members, even a few numbers he didn't recognize. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen. He wasn't ready. He wasn't ready to relive it, to explain, to justify his existence. He tossed the phone back onto the nightstand, the small act of defiance, a fleeting moment of control in a situation that felt increasingly out of his hands. He poured himself a mug of coffee, the bitter aroma filling the small kitchen. He needed to clear his head, to figure out what to do next. His lawyer, Trevor Holcomb, had advised him to stay quiet, to let things cool down. Cool down, he thought bitterly, as if the humiliation he'd endured could simply evaporate like morning mist. Suddenly, a sharp, insistent ring pierced the quiet. His laptop. He rarely used it, preferring the anonymity of his phone. He stared at the screen, a wave of apprehension washing over him. He hadn't checked his social media, hadn't dared to look. He knew it would be there, the video, the evidence of his humiliation plastered across the internet for all to see. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the keyboard. He knew he had to face it eventually, but a part of him, a primal, self-preserving instinct, urged him to turn away, to bury his head in the sand and pretend it wasn't happening. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and clicked on the Facebook icon. The video was there at the top of his feed, a stark thumbnail image of him in handcuffs, surrounded by police officers. His stomach lurched. He clicked on the play button, the sound of his own voice, strained and bewildered, filling the room. He watched as the officers barked orders, their faces grim, their movements rough. He saw the confusion in his own eyes, the disbelief that this was happening, that this was his life now. He watched as Mrs. Garner, his elderly neighbor, stepped forward, her voice trembling as she tried to explain. He felt a surge of gratitude for her small act of defiance, for her willingness to speak up. The caption beneath the video, written by Mrs. Garner's grandson Malik, hit him like a punch to the gut. "This man fought for us, and look how they treat him." The words, simple yet powerful, encapsulated the injustice of it all. The comment section was a flurry of activity, a mixture of outrage, support, and the inevitable hateful rhetoric that festered in the dark corners of the internet. He scrolled through the comments, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. Shame, anger, and a flicker of hope. Messages from his former squad mates began to pour in, words of support, offers of help, shared outrage. "Stay strong, brother," one message read. "We've got you back." Another simply said, "This isn't right." He read through the messages, each one a small lifeline in the sea of negativity. He wasn't alone. He wasn't forgotten. The realization, simple yet profound, settled deep within him, a small ember of warmth in the cold, harsh reality of his situation. The video was trending, spreading like wildfire across the city, the state, the country. The injustice of it, captured in stark, unflinching detail, was impossible to ignore. The world was watching. And for the first time since it happened, Darius felt a glimmer of hope. This, he knew, was the turning point. The Wednesday morning sunlight, filtered through the dusty blinds, cast stripes across the worn rug in Darius's living room. He sat on the edge of his sofa, the worn leather cool against his bare arms. The silence of his small apartment pressed in on him, a stark contrast to the roaring chaos that had consumed his life in the days since the incident. He still struggled to process it, to reconcile the absurdity of being cuffed in his own neighborhood, the metal biting into his wrists with the quiet ordinariness of this now. He ran a hand over his close-cropped hair, a nervous habit he'd picked up in the Marines. His reflection in the dark television screen stared back, a stranger etched with exhaustion and a disquiet that burrowed deep within his bones. It felt as though a crucial part of him, a part he hadn't realized was so essential, had been chipped away, leaving a raw, exposed nerve. He hadn't slept properly in days, the replay of flashing lights and accusing eyes playing on an endless loop behind his eyelids. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Mrs. Garner's face, a mixture of fear and apology etched deep into her wrinkles. He hoped she hadn't suffered too much fallout from her inadvertent role in this whole mess. He shifted, the sofa springs groaning beneath him, a sound that mirrored the unease in his gut. This wasn't how his return home was supposed to be. He dreamt of quiet, of rebuilding a life away from the structured rigor of the military. Now he found himself battling a different kind of war, one fought on the subtle, shifting terrain of public opinion and ingrained prejudice. The shrill ringing of the phone sliced through the quiet, making him jump. His hand fumbled for the receiver, a sudden jolt of anxiety spiking through him. Was it the police? Reporters? The thought of facing another barrage of questions, of having to relive the humiliation over and over, made his stomach clench. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the phone. He almost didn't answer, tempted to let it ring into the void, but a nagging sense of obligation, drilled into him over years of service, compelled him to pick up. "Hello." His voice was rough, sleep-deprived. "Darius call, train?" A crisp, professional voice on the other end. Female. A slight tremor of apprehension ran through him. "Another interrogation?" "Speaking. This is Commander Layla King from the Marine Forces Public Affairs Office. I'm calling on behalf of the Commandant." Darius's grip on the receiver tightened. The Commandant? His mind raced, trying to decipher the reason for such a high-level call. Had he done something wrong? Violated some obscure military regulation he'd forgotten in his transition back to civilian life? The uncertainty gnawed at him. "Commander," he prompted, the single word laced with a mixture of confusion and apprehension. "We're aware of the incident, Mr. Coltrane," Commander King continued, her voice carefully neutral, yet there was a subtle undercurrent of something else concern. "It's making its way through the channels. Command is watching closely." A wave of something akin to relief washed over him, so faint he almost missed it. Someone was watching. He wasn't alone in this surreal nightmare. It was a small thing, a flicker of hope in the oppressive darkness that had enveloped him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I appreciate that, Commander," he managed, his voice still thick with sleep and a lingering residue of the past few days. There was a brief pause on the other end, a silence freighted with unspoken words. He could almost hear the gears turning, the careful consideration behind her next sentence. "Mr. Coltrane," Commander King said, her voice now taking on a different quality, a hint of steel beneath the professional veneer. "I want to assure you, you're not invisible." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. They weren't just a statement of fact, they were a promise, a declaration of solidarity. A lump formed in Darius's throat. He swallowed hard, fighting back the unexpected surge of emotion. Invisibility was precisely how he had felt a ghost in his own life. Seen, but not truly recognized, his service, his sacrifice, reduced to the color of his skin. The simple acknowledgement from someone within the very institution he had dedicated his life to felt profound. It was a lifeline thrown out in the turbulent sea of his current reality. "Thank you, Commander," he finally said, his voice low and rough. The words felt inadequate, failing to capture the depth of gratitude he felt. The ensuing silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken understanding. He knew there were limitations to what she could say, the intricate dance of military protocol and public image. Yet, within those carefully chosen words, he heard a message of support, a silent affirmation that he wasn't alone in this fight. The call ended shortly after, leaving Darius standing in the quiet of his living room, the phone still warm in his hand. The sunlight seemed a little brighter now, the shadows a little less menacing. The weight on his chest, the suffocating feeling of isolation, had lessened, replaced by a fragile tendril of hope. He was not invisible. Someone was watching. And for the first time since that horrific night, he felt a spark of something he hadn't realized he'd lost: the will to fight. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom hummed, a sterile counterpoint to the thrum of anxiety vibrating in Darius's chest. Thursday. 2 days since the world had tilted on its axis. 2 days since the weight of other people's perceptions had pressed him into the asphalt. He sat at the witness stand, the polished wood cool beneath his palms, the microphone a cold, metallic presence before him. Roanoke, Virginia, a town he'd chosen for its quiet charm, its promise of a peaceful life after his service in the Marines. Now, that peace felt like a shattered illusion. He could feel the weight of gazes, the silent judgment hanging heavy in the air. He reminded himself to breathe, slow and even, just as he'd trained himself to do under fire. "Mr. Coltrane," the city attorney's voice cut through the quiet, smooth and practiced, "can you describe the events of Tuesday afternoon?" Darius swallowed, the dryness in his throat a sudden impediment. His lawyer, Trevor Holcomb, a man whose calm demeanor radiated from him like a force field, gave him a small, encouraging nod. He'd prepped Darius for this, drilled him on the importance of remaining calm, of sticking to the facts. But facts, Darius was realizing, felt pale and inadequate against the visceral reality of the experience. "I was helping Mrs. Garner, my neighbor, fix her fence," Darius began, his voice steadier than he expected. He could feel the phantom pressure of the handcuffs on his wrists, the sting of the rough asphalt against his cheek. He forced himself to focus on the words, on the measured cadence of his speech. A panel had come loose in the wind. He glanced towards Mrs. Garner, a small, bird-like woman seated in the gallery. Her presence, a silent testament to his innocence, was a small anchor in the swirling currents of his unease. Inside, a different narrative unfolded. A panel had come loose. Such a mundane act, such an ordinary moment, and yet it had become the pivot point on which his life had turned. He wondered if Mrs. Garner felt the same weight, the same surreal displacement. He imagined her fragile frame, the steel in her spine that had allowed her to stand up to the officers, to speak truth in the face of their preconceived notions. And then, the attorney prompted, his tone neutral, almost bored. The very neutrality felt like an accusation. Then the police arrived, Darius continued, the words catching in his throat. The image of the flashing lights, the sudden rush of adrenaline, the cold steel of the gun pressed against his template all surged back with a sickening clarity. They approached me with their weapons drawn. He closed his eyes briefly, willing the image to recede. He could hear Trevor's soft intake of breath beside him. "Stay calm, Darius. Stay calm. Did you identify yourself?" Trevor's voice, calm and controlled, cut through the tension. "Yes," Darius replied, opening his eyes. "I told them my name. I showed them my military ID, explained I was a Marine, helping my neighbor. I told them I wasn't armed." And their response? They didn't seem to care, Darius said, the words heavy with the weight of his frustration. "They handcuffed me, forced me to the ground. The courtroom felt stifling, the air thick with unspoken accusations. They didn't care. They saw only the color of my skin, the perceived threat. The thought, sharp and bitter, twisted in his gut. Mr. Coltrane, the city attorney interjected, his voice slick and condescending. "Isn't it standard procedure for officers to respond with caution to reports of a suspicious individual with a possible weapon?" Darius felt a surge of anger, hot and swift. "I wasn't suspicious," he retorted, his voice tight with controlled fury. "I was helping my neighbor. I was in my own yard. I posed no threat." But the 911 call described a black man, behaving erratically, possibly carrying a weapon. The attorney's words hung in the air, barbed and accusatory. Darius's breath hitched. Erratically? Because I was using a hammer? Because I was black? He glanced at Trevor, who gave him a subtle shake of his head. A reminder to breathe, to stay focused. "I was scared," Darius admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But not because of what I did, because of what they thought I might do." The words hung in the silence, heavy with the unspoken truth. He saw Mrs. Garner shift in her seat, her small frame radiating an unexpected strength. He knew she understood. The city attorney continued his line of questioning, attempting to justify the officer's actions, to paint a picture of a justified response to a perceived threat. But Darius held his ground, his testimony a stark and unwavering account of the events of that afternoon. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that even if he won this battle, the war was far from over. The fight for justice, for recognition, for the simple right to exist without fear was a fight he was now irrevocably a part of. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom hallway hummed, a dull, insistent drone that mirrored the thrumming anxiety in Darius's chest. The air, thick with the scent of stale coffee and antiseptic cleaner, felt heavy, oppressive. Around him, a cacophony of voices rose and fell, the hushed whispers of lawyers conferring with their clients, the staccato tapping of heels on the tiled floor, the insistent buzzing of reporters' phones. He stood amidst the swirling chaos, a solitary figure in a storm, his hands clasped loosely before him, his gaze fixed on the far wall, a blank canvas upon which his thoughts projected a dizzying array of possibilities. He felt a strange disconnect, as if observing the scene from a distance, his own life unfolding on a screen before him. "Mr. Coltrane, Mr. Coltrane." A word for CNN. A microphone thrust itself into his personal space, a black, cylindrical intrusion into the carefully constructed bubble of silence he had erected around himself. The reporter, a young woman with sharp, inquisitive eyes and a determined set to her jaw, jostled for position, her eagerness palpable. He registered her words, processed them, yet his lips remained sealed. He could feel the weight of their expectant gazes, the unspoken demand for a soundbite, a reaction, a glimpse into the turmoil they assumed must be raging within him. But he refused to feed the frenzy. This wasn't about him. It was bigger than him. It was about a system, broken and biased, that needed to be dismantled brick by painful brick. His silence was a form of protest, a refusal to be reduced to a spectacle, a symbol. Mr. Coltrane, how does it feel knowing your story is going national? Do you have a message for the police department? For the nation? Her voice, sharp and clear, cut through the air, each question a tiny barb tugging at his composure. He took a slow, measured breath, the cool air a welcome balm against the rising heat in his chest. He closed his eyes for a fleeting moment, picturing the faces of his fellow Marines, the men and women who had served alongside him, who understood the meaning of duty, of honor, of sacrifice. This fight was for them too, for all the others who had been unjustly targeted, silenced, marginalized. He opened his eyes, his gaze still fixed on the distant wall, the swirling chaos around him fading into the background. The reporter, sensing his unwavering resolve, finally retreated, her initial enthusiasm replaced by a flicker of frustration. Darius, a calm, steady voice broke through the receding clamor. Trevor Holcomb, his lawyer, a man whose presence exuded quiet competence and unwavering support, placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "There's someone here you didn't expect." The cryptic statement caught Darius off guard, a ripple disturbing the still waters of his resolve. He turned to face Holcomb, a question forming in his eyes. Who? Why? The questions tumbled through his mind, each one a pebble tossed into the placid lake of his composure, creating ever-widening circles of uncertainty. He searched Holcomb's face, seeking a clue, an answer, anything to quell the sudden surge of apprehension. The older man's expression was unreadable, a carefully constructed mask that betrayed nothing. The air crackled with unspoken words, with the weight of an impending revelation. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of the courtroom clock amplified in the sudden hush that had fallen over the hallway. The reporters, their initial fervor momentarily subdued, shifted their attention, their collective gaze now fixed on the entrance to the hallway, as if drawn by an invisible force. A palpable tension filled the air, a sense of anticipation so thick it could be cut with a knife. Darius felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He ran a hand through his close-cropped hair, a nervous gesture he hadn't realized he'd adopted. He tried to steady his breathing, to regain the sense of calm he had so carefully cultivated. But the anticipation, the uncertainty, gnawed at him, eroding his composure. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a wave of whispers and hushed exclamations. Darius followed their gaze, his heart pounding against his ribs. A figure emerged from the throng, a figure so unexpected, so improbable, that for a moment Darius questioned the reality of what he was seeing. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, convinced he was hallucinating, but the figure remained, solid and unmistakable. The 4 stars gleaming on the crisp uniform were undeniable. General Raymond Ellison, a legend in the Marine Corps, a man whose name resonated with authority and respect, stood before him, his presence filling the hallway with an aura of power and gravitas. Darius stared, speechless, his mind struggling to reconcile the image before him with the reality of the situation. What was General Ellison doing here? Why was a 4-star general, a man whose time was undoubtedly precious and meticulously scheduled, standing in a crowded courtroom hallway? The questions swirled in his mind, a tempest of confusion and disbelief. The general met his gaze, his expression unreadable, yet there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of steel beneath the surface of his composure. He moved towards Darius, his steps measured and deliberate, each footfall echoing in the sudden silence that had descended upon the hallway. The reporters, momentarily stunned into silence, surged forward, their cameras flashing, their microphones thrusting forward like hungry mouths. But the general ignored them, his focus solely on Darius. He stopped before him, his presence radiating an almost tangible sense of authority. "Sergeant Coltrane," he said, his voice deep and resonant, cutting through the clamor like a knife through butter. The use of his former rank, a subtle yet significant gesture, sent a shiver down Darius's spine. He snapped to attention, a reflex ingrained through years of military discipline. He felt a surge of conflicting emotions: pride, confusion, a flicker of hope. The general's gaze held his, unwavering, intense. "I believe you deserve an apology," he said, his voice low, yet carrying an unmistakable weight. The words hung in the air, charged with meaning, a promise of something more, something bigger, something that transcended the confines of this crowded hallway and the injustice that had brought them here. The air crackled with anticipation, the silence pregnant with unspoken words, the promise of a reckoning. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom hummed, a dull, insistent drone that mirrored the tension tightening in Darius's chest. Thursday. He'd lost count of the hours spent staring at the grain of the wooden table, the minutes ticking by like grains of sand in an hourglass. Each one a reminder of the weight pressing down on him, the invisible shackles of accusation. He ran a hand over his close-cropped hair, the familiar texture grounding him amidst the swirling anxiety. He'd faced down Taliban fighters in the desolate mountains of Afghanistan, but this sterile, hushed battlefield of legalese felt far more treacherous. His gaze drifted to the witness stand, a stark island in the sea of polished wood. He swallowed, his throat dry. This was it. A small, bird-like woman, Mrs. Garner, perched on the edge of the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her wrinkled face, framed by a halo of white hair, was a canvas of apprehension. Darius knew her, the sweet old lady from 2 houses down who always left a basket of fresh-baked cookies on his porch. He'd felt a pang of guilt when he realized she was the one who'd called the police. He'd seen the fear in her eyes that day, a fear he understood all too well, though for vastly different reasons. Now, under the weight of the oath, her voice trembled. "He's always been kind," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He could see her struggling, the words catching in her throat. "Always polite. He'd help me with my groceries, always with a smile. He waters my petunias when I'm away." He saw her glance at him, fleeting but filled with a silent apology. His jaw clenched. Kind, polite. Those words, meant to be redeeming, felt like a brand. Was that all he was? Reduced to simple platitudes in the face of prejudice? Mrs. Garner, Trevor Holcomb, his lawyer, a man whose calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the tempest raging within Darius, spoke with a quiet strength. "Can you describe what happened on the day in question?" She inhaled shakily. "I saw him walking down the street wearing a hoodie." Her voice trailed off. Darius felt a flicker of frustration. A hoodie, another brand. He closed his eyes briefly, fighting the wave of bitterness. "And what made you call the police?" Trevor's voice was gentle, guiding her through the narrative. He looked suspicious," she admitted, her gaze fixed on her knotted hands. Then, her head snapped up, her eyes meeting Darius's. A flicker of something akin to defiance flashed across her face. "But you want to know what scared me? The way those officers looked at him, the way they treated him, like he was already guilty." Her voice cracked on the last word. A ripple went through the courtroom. Darius felt a sudden lump in his throat. He'd been so focused on his own fear, his own indignation, that he'd forgotten the fear of others. Mrs. Garner's fear wasn't of him, but of the system, of the power it wielded so carelessly. The city's lawyer, a sharp-faced woman with an air of impatient efficiency, began her cross-examination, her questions clipped and pointed. Darius listened, his mind detached, analyzing her tactics, her attempts to undermine Mrs. Garner's testimony. He could almost smell the desperation in her carefully constructed arguments. But the tide had turned. One by one, the witnesses took the stand. Sergeant Alex Duran, a retired Marine, his face etched with the scars of battle, stood ramrod straight, his voice ringing with conviction. "Coltrane saved my life in Afghanistan," he stated, his gaze unwavering. "He pulled me out of a burning Humvee under heavy fire. He shielded me with his own body. That's the man you put in handcuffs. Darius felt a strange mix of pride and shame, the memories of that day flashing before his eyes, the smell of burning metal and cordite filling his nostrils. A former teacher spoke of Darius's dedication to his studies, his quiet intelligence. A fellow sniper testified to his impeccable character, his unwavering sense of justice. A pastor spoke of his compassion, his commitment to his community. Each voice, each story, chipped away at the facade the city had so carefully constructed. The courtroom air grew thick with unspoken truths. The city's attempts at justification crumbled under the weight of the testimonies. Darius watched, his heart pounding a slow, steady rhythm against his ribs. He'd expected anger, resentment, but what he felt was a weary sense of resignation, a quiet determination hardening within him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the countless others who had faced and would continue to face the same injustice. It was about the system that allowed it to happen. He glanced at General Ellison, sitting in the back row, his presence a silent testament to the ripples this case had created. The general hadn't said a word, but his presence spoke volumes. It spoke of a shift in the balance of power, a crack in the foundation of complacency. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade into the background as a new sound emerged, the quiet murmur of hope. A hope that perhaps, finally, something would change. The air in the courtroom hung thick with anticipation, a strange blend of stale coffee and nervous perspiration. Darius sat beside Trevor Holcomb, his lawyer, the starched collar of his shirt chafing against his neck. He felt a tremor in his leg, a persistent twitch that betrayed the forced calmness he projected. The events of the past week, the humiliating arrest, the viral video, the whispers and stares, they had all coalesced into a heavy weight pressing on his chest. He tried to focus on Trevor's quiet reassurances, the methodical tap of his pen against the legal pad, but his mind kept replaying the cold steel of the handcuffs, the accusing eyes of the officers, the bewildered faces of the onlookers. He could still feel the phantom pressure on his wrists, a ghostly reminder of the injustice he'd endured. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the proceedings. Darius scanned the faces in the gallery, a sea of curious onlookers, journalists scribbling furiously, and a few familiar faces from his neighborhood. He saw Mrs. Garner, her small frame perched on the edge of the bench, her eyes fixed on him with a mixture of sympathy and steely resolve. He offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of her courage in coming forward. Her testimony, her clear and unwavering account of the incident, had been a small beacon of hope in the darkness. It had affirmed what he already knew. He wasn't crazy. What happened wasn't right. A sudden hush fell over the courtroom. The bailiff's voice rang out, announcing the arrival of a witness. Darius shifted in his seat, a knot tightening in his stomach. He expected the city's legal representative, a man whose practiced indifference had grated on him during the pre-trial meetings. But the figure that emerged from the side door was not who he expected. A ripple of murmurs swept through the gallery. Darius's breath caught in his throat. It was General Raymond Ellison, a four-star general in the Marine Corps, a man whose name resonated with authority and respect. Darius had only seen him in photographs, a figure of almost mythical stature. His presence here, in this small courtroom, felt surreal, like a scene from a dream. The general moved with an air of quiet command, his uniform impeccable, his gaze steady. He took the stand, his every movement precise and deliberate. He raised his hand, taking the oath with a gravity that silenced the room. Darius felt a strange mix of awe and confusion. Why was the general here? Trevor leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. This changes everything, Darius. Darius could only nod, his mind racing. He couldn't fathom the general's involvement, the sudden shift in the atmosphere of the courtroom. The city's lawyer began his questioning, his voice tinged with a nervous deference that hadn't been there before. The general's responses were concise, his tone measured, but his words carried a weight that seemed to reverberate through the room. He spoke of Darius's exemplary service record, his unwavering dedication to his country, the sacrifices he had made. He painted a picture of a man who had served with honor, a man who deserved respect, not suspicion. Then, the general's voice shifted, taking on a sharper edge. He addressed the incident directly, his words cutting through the legal jargon and polite formalities. He spoke of the inherent biases that plague law enforcement, the systemic racism that permeates institutions, the insidious nature of prejudice that targets individuals based on the color of their skin. "This isn't just a local matter," he said, his voice resonating with authority. "This is personal. This is national. This is not how we treat our own." Darius felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of gratitude and overwhelming sadness. The general's words validated his experience, acknowledged the injustice he'd suffered. He had never felt so seen, so understood. The city's lawyer stumbled through a series of weak rebuttals, his arguments sounding hollow and unconvincing in the face of the general's unwavering conviction. The general's presence had shifted the narrative, transformed the courtroom from a place of judgment to a platform for truth. Then came the moment that etched itself into Darius's memory. The general turned to him, his gaze direct and unwavering. He spoke not as a high-ranking officer, but as a fellow Marine, as a human being. "Darius Coltrane," he said, his voice filled with a quiet sincerity. "I apologize in behalf of every institution that failed to protect you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Darius felt a lump form in his throat, the weight on his chest lifting, replaced by a strange sense of peace. He had been heard. His story mattered. The general's testimony continued, detailing specific policy changes he would personally oversee within the police department, measures to address bias, to improve training, to foster accountability. He spoke with a quiet determination, his words carrying the weight of his position, the promise of real change. As the general stepped down from the stand, the courtroom erupted in applause. Darius sat there, stunned, the sound washing over him like a wave. He looked at Trevor, who offered a small, knowing smile. "It's over, Darius," Trevor said softly. "You won." Darius didn't know if he'd won. He hadn't sued for money, hadn't sought retribution. He had simply wanted to be seen, to be heard, to be treated with the dignity he deserved. The general's intervention had done more than just resolve his case. It had exposed a deeper wound, a systemic illness that needed healing. He knew the fight wasn't over, that the road to true justice was long and arduous. But in this moment, in this small courtroom, he felt a flicker of hope, a sense that perhaps, just perhaps, things could change. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom hummed, a dull, insistent drone that mirrored the tension tightening Darius's chest. He could feel the weight of gazes, a tangible pressure on his skin. The air itself felt thick, suffocating, laden with the unspoken words, the simmering emotions of everyone present. He shifted slightly in the hard wooden chair, the starched fabric of his suit rustling, a small, insignificant sound in the cavernous room. He wondered, not for the first time, how something so mundane walking home could have spiraled into this public spectacle. The past weeks had been a blur of legal jargon, hushed phone calls, and the constant, gnawing feeling of injustice. His own face, plastered across news screens and social media feeds, had become a stranger to him, a symbol, a rallying cry. He longed for the anonymity he'd once taken for granted, the simple peace of his own four walls. Judge Mallory cleared her throat, the sound amplified by the courtroom's acoustics. The murmuring died down, replaced by an expectant silence. Darius watched her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Her face, etched with years of legal battles, was unreadable. "This court has reviewed the evidence presented and heard the testimonies," she began, her voice steady and resonant. Each word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Darius's heart hammered against his ribs. He could feel Trevor's reassuring presence beside him, a silent anchor in the storm. He hadn't realized how tightly he'd been holding his breath until he exhaled a long, shaky release. "This court will recommend a full policy review of the procedures regarding civilian interaction," specifically focusing on de-escalation tactics and racial bias. The words resonated through the courtroom, each syllable a small crack in the wall of indifference Darius had come to expect. He closed his eyes for a moment, the judge's words echoing in his mind. A policy review. Training. It wasn't the outright condemnation he'd hoped for, the public apology that would never come, but it was something. A small step, a flicker of hope in the pervasive darkness. He thought of Mrs. Garner, her voice trembling but resolute as she recounted the events of that night. He thought of Trevor, his calm, strategic maneuvering, his unwavering belief in his client. He thought of General Ellison, his unexpected appearance in court, his powerful words shaming the system into acknowledging its flaws. A strange mix of gratitude and weariness washed over him. Furthermore, the judge continued, we will be recommending that officers involved receive updated de-escalation and bias training. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Darius opened his eyes, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the gallery. Relief warred with disappointment within him. Training wouldn't erase what had happened, wouldn't undo the fear, the humiliation, the violation. But perhaps, just perhaps, it would prevent another innocent man from experiencing the same ordeal. He felt a hand on his shoulder, Trevor's firm, reassuring grip. He looked at his lawyer, saw the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. It wasn't a victory, not completely, but it was a start. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun felt surprisingly warm on Darius's face. The throng of reporters and cameras surged forward, a cacophony of questions and flashing lights. He shielded his eyes, momentarily disoriented. Trevor steered him through the crowd, a protective presence at his side. The air buzzed with energy, a strange mix of anger and hope. People held signs, some condemning the police, others supporting Darius. He heard snippets of conversations, fragments of opinions, a tapestry of public reaction woven around him. He felt a strange detachment, as if he were watching a play unfold, a drama in which he was both the protagonist and the audience. He wasn't sure what he felt. Relief? Disappointment? A strange, hollow exhaustion. A young black man, his face earnest, his eyes bright with a mix of admiration and gratitude, approached him. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke, his voice low and fervent. "Thank you," he said, his gaze locking with Darius's, "for not staying quiet." The words, simple yet profound, resonated deep within Darius's soul. He looked at the young man, saw his own reflection in his hopeful eyes. He felt a surge of emotion, something akin to purpose, ignite within him. He hadn't sought this fight, hadn't asked to become a symbol. But perhaps, he thought, perhaps this was why. Perhaps this was the reason he'd been chosen to endure this ordeal. To give voice to the voiceless, to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The weight on his chest didn't disappear entirely, but it shifted, transformed into something else. Not quite hope, not yet, but a flicker, a spark, a quiet determination to keep walking, to keep fighting, to keep speaking truth to power. The road ahead was long, the battle far from over. But in that moment, standing under the warm afternoon sun, surrounded by the echoes of change, Darius felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, a sense of hope. The fight wasn't his alone, and that, he realized, made all the difference. The silence of his home pressed in on Darius, a heavy blanket woven from the echoes of the past weeks. The crisp, formal apology from the Roanoke Police Department sat on his kitchen table, the stark black ink a stark contrast against the worn wood. He'd read it 3 times, each word a pebble tossed into the still pond of his mind, rippling outwards in concentric circles of disbelief, anger, and a reluctant, fragile hope. An apology. The words felt foreign, inadequate, almost mocking in their official sterility. They couldn't erase the raw, visceral memory of cold steel against his wrists, the asphalt scraping his cheek, the flash of cameras capturing his humiliation for the world to see. They can't give me back that moment, he thought, the phantom weight of the cuffs pressing against his skin. He picked up the letter again, the paper crinkling faintly in the quiet. Reassignment resignation review of procedures. The phrases danced before his eyes, blurring into meaninglessness. What did it all amount to? Would it stop another Darius Coltrane from being wrongly accused, wrongly judged, wrongly humiliated? The television murmured in the background, a news anchor recapping the events of the hearing. General Ellison's unexpected intervention replayed for the 10th time that day. Darius found himself strangely detached from the image on the screen, the man in handcuffs a stranger he barely recognized. He switched it off, the sudden silence amplifying the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall. He needed air. Stepping out onto his porch, he inhaled deeply, the scent of freshly cut grass a stark contrast to the sterile air of the courtroom. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors, a mixture of curiosity and something akin to respect. He'd spent his life serving his country, only to be treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood. The irony wasn't lost on him. Now, after the storm, the community was trying to piece itself back together, the fractures visible but perhaps, just perhaps, beginning to mend. Mrs. Garner, his elderly neighbor whose frantic call had set the whole ordeal in motion, approached hesitantly, her eyes filled with a remorse that mirrored his own weariness. "Darius, dear," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I don't know what to say." He looked at her, the lines etched on her face deeper than he remembered, a testament to the shared burden of the past weeks. He knew she hadn't meant any harm, that her fear had been born of ignorance, not malice. He also knew that her fear, however misplaced, had exposed a deeper, more insidious fear that permeated their society. "It's okay, Mrs. Garner," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. "It's over now." The words felt heavy, laden with unspoken truths. Over? He wondered. Is it really over? The incident, the arrest, the hearing, they were over. But the fight, he knew, the fight for true equality, for genuine understanding, that fight was far from over. A few days later, a thick envelope arrived, bearing the official seal of the Pentagon. Inside, a crisp letter invited him to participate in a forum on bias and law enforcement responses to veterans of color. He ran his finger over the embossed seal, a strange mixture of pride and resentment swirling within him. A forum, he mused, the word echoing in the cavern of his thoughts. A platform to dissect the very issue that nearly broke me. The thought was both daunting and empowering. He reread the letter, each word resonating with the weight of responsibility. "Your experiences," it read, "offer invaluable insights into the challenges faced by veterans returning to civilian life." He closed his eyes, picturing the faces of his fellow Marines, men and women who had served their country with unwavering loyalty, only to be met with suspicion and prejudice upon their return. He saw their faces, heard their unspoken struggles, and felt a surge of resolve hardening within him. This isn't just about me, he realized, the thought a sudden, sharp clarity in the fog of his emotions. This is about all of us. The news of his invitation spread quickly, his phone buzzing with calls from reporters, community leaders, and even a few politicians. He declined most of the interviews, the thought of reliving the incident under the harsh glare of public scrutiny exhausting. He needed time to process, to heal, to decide what his next move would be. The world, it seemed, was eager for a symbol, a hero, a spokesperson for a cause. But he wasn't sure he was ready to be any of those things. He was just Darius Coltrane, a Marine, a veteran, a man trying to find his way back to a life he'd left behind. He thought of his time in the Corps, the camaraderie, the shared purpose, the unwavering sense of belonging. He longed for that sense of belonging now, a place where he wasn't defined by the color of his skin, but by the content of his character. He sat on his porch again, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a breathtaking display of nature's resilience. The world kept turning, oblivious to the turmoil in his heart. The crickets chirped their evening song, a soothing rhythm against the backdrop of the quiet neighborhood. He closed his eyes, the gentle breeze carrying the scent of honeysuckle and the faint, distant sound of children's laughter. For the first time in weeks, a genuine smile touched his lips. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, in this moment of quiet reflection, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope, a fragile ember glowing in the darkness. The future remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: he wouldn't be silenced. He would find his voice, not just for himself, but for every veteran, every person who had ever been unjustly judged, wrongly accused, and denied the basic human right to simply be. The air in the Pentagon Forum hung heavy, a strange blend of polished formality and nervous anticipation. Darius sat stiffly in his assigned seat, the starched fabric of his shirt chafing against the still healing abrasions on his wrists. He felt the weight of hundreds of eyes, some curious, some sympathetic, some evaluative. He shifted in his seat, the small movement amplified in the cavernous silence. This was a different kind of battlefield. No flashing lights, no barking dogs, no cold steel against his skin. But the tension coiled in his stomach felt eerily familiar. "This isn't about you, Darius," he told himself, clenching his jaw. "This is about," he trailed off, unsure how to finish the thought. Was this about justice? About closure? About something bigger than himself? He couldn't quite grasp it. The echoing click of a microphone jolted him back to the present. A high-ranking official, a man whose name Darius couldn't quite recall, was speaking, his voice amplified, filling the vast space with carefully chosen words about diversity, inclusion, and the unwavering commitment to the well-being of all service members. Darius listened, but the words seemed to float on the surface, failing to penetrate the wall of unease that had settled around him. He thought back to the night of the incident, the cold asphalt against his cheek, the biting metal of the handcuffs, the humiliating stares of his neighbors. He thought of his grandmother, her voice trembling as she recounted stories of a different era, of a different kind of injustice. Had anything really changed? He heard his name, a sharp, clear sound that cut through the hum of the crowd. He looked up, startled. It was his turn. He rose, his legs strangely heavy, and walked to the podium, each step a conscious effort. The microphone loomed before him, a metallic sentinel. He reached for it, his hand trembling slightly. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the expectant silence. He looked out at the sea of faces, a mix of uniforms and suits, and felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. "Just breathe, Darius," he commanded himself. "Just tell your story." He began to speak, his voice low and hesitant at first, but gaining strength as he went along. He described the incident, the casual racism of the officers, the fear that had gripped him, the humiliation that had burned in his soul. He spoke of the absurdity of being a decorated veteran, a man who had risked his life for his country, being treated like a common criminal in his own neighborhood. He didn't embellish. He didn't exaggerate. He simply told the truth, his voice raw with emotion. As he spoke, he noticed a shift in the room. The initial polite attentiveness morphed into something deeper, something more visceral. He saw nods of understanding, expressions of empathy, even tears in some eyes. And then he saw them. Other veterans of color, scattered throughout the audience, their faces mirroring his own experiences, their postures reflecting years of silently endured injustices. He drew a deep breath, feeling a surge of unexpected strength. "I'm not here because I want justice just for me," he said, his voice resonating with newfound conviction. He looked directly at the Secretary of Defense, seated in the front row, his expression unreadable. "If we say we honor veterans, we can't just mean parades and bumper stickers. We got to mean dignity. We got to mean accountability." The silence that followed his words was heavy, pregnant with unspoken truths. Then a ripple of applause started, tentative at first, but quickly growing into a thunderous ovation. Darius stood at the podium, bathed in the applause, a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion washing over him. He hadn't planned to make a speech. He hadn't intended to become a symbol. But in that moment, he realized that his experience, his pain, had a purpose beyond his own individual healing. The Secretary of Defense approached him, his hand outstretched. You said what a lot of us have been trying to say, he said, his voice low and sincere. You're needed out here. Darius looked at the secretary, searching his eyes for any hint of insincerity, any trace of political maneuvering. He found none. He saw only a genuine recognition of the problem, a sincere desire for change. And in that moment, something within Darius shifted. The weight of his experience, the burden of injustice, began to feel less like a personal affliction and more like a shared responsibility. He knew that the fight was far from over. He knew that systemic change wouldn't happen overnight. But he also knew that he was no longer alone. He had found his voice, and he had found his purpose. He was a Marine. He was a veteran, and he was ready to fight a different kind of war. A war for dignity. A war for accountability. A war for a future where the color of his skin wouldn't define his worth. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the freshly painted community center in Roanoke, Virginia. The air, thick with the scent of pine and freshly cut grass, vibrated with the rhythmic thud of a basketball. Darius watched the group of kids, a mix of black and white, laughing as they scrambled for the rebound. Months had passed since the incident, months that had etched themselves onto his soul like the lines on his palms. The rawness of the humiliation, the fear that had choked him, it was all still there, a phantom limb he could almost feel. But something else had taken root too, something unexpected. He'd become a symbol, a reluctant figurehead for a change he wasn't sure he was ready to lead. Yet, there he was, spending his Saturdays at the newly renovated community center, coaching kids who looked at him not with pity or fear, but with admiration. The squeak of sneakers on the polished floor echoed in the otherwise quiet gym. He caught the eye of a young boy, no older than 10, struggling to keep up with the older kids. Darius felt a pang of recognition, a whisper of that same helplessness he'd felt staring into the indifferent eyes of the officers. He walked over, offering a quiet word of encouragement, adjusting the boy's grip on the ball. "Keep your eye on the basket, son. Don't let the noise get to you." The boy nodded, his small face serious with concentration. Darius knew it wasn't just about basketball. It was about finding your footing in a world that often seemed determined to knock you down. Later, sitting on the steps of the community center, the fading sunlight warming his face, Darius unfolded a crisp, official-looking letter. The weight of the paper felt heavy in his hands, the stark white envelope a stark contrast to the vibrant colors of the children's drawings taped to the center's doors. General Ellison. The name still held a strange power, a reminder of the unexpected turn his life had taken. He hesitated, a flicker of unease in his chest. He hadn't sought out this attention, this responsibility. He just wanted to go home. He inhaled deeply, the scent of pine needles sharp and clean, and finally opened the letter. The general's words were concise, direct, yet carried a surprising warmth. "You reminded me why I joined in the first place. Don't stop. We still need you." Darius reread the lines, each word resonating deep within him. A strange mix of emotions churned inside him: pride, humility, and a heavy sense of obligation. He'd never considered himself a leader, a voice for change. He just wanted peace, the simple comfort of normalcy. Yet, the general's words, the weight of them, settled upon him like a mantle he couldn't shrug off. The slam of a car door broke through his thoughts. A young police officer, his uniform crisp and new, approached hesitantly. Darius recognized him, Officer Green, one of the newer recruits at the Roanoke Police Department. He stiffened, the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. The uniform, the badge, they were still triggers, reminders of the day that had fractured his sense of safety. "Mr. Coltrane," Officer Green began, his voice a nervous tremor. "Can I have a minute?" Darius studied the young officer's face, searching for any trace of the indifference, the casual prejudice he'd encountered before. But all he saw was genuine apprehension, a flicker of respect. He nodded slowly, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. "Sure, officer." He kept his voice neutral, his expression carefully blank, even though a storm of emotions raged inside him. Officer Green shifted from foot to foot, his gaze fixed on the ground. I just wanted you to know, he stammered, that they use your case file now. In training. To show us what not to do. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy with unspoken meaning. Darius stared at him, his mind reeling. His case file. A textbook example of what not to do. A bitter laugh threatened to escape his lips. Was this justice? Was this change? He felt a strange detachment, as though he were watching the scene unfold from a distance. They're trying to change things, Mr. Coltrane, Officer Green continued, his voice gaining a little strength. Your experience, it made a difference. Darius looked around at the renovated community center, at the kids playing basketball, at the fading light painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He thought of General Ellison's words, the weight of responsibility they carried. He thought of the fear that still clung to him, the phantom pain of injustice. And then he looked at Officer Green, at the earnest hope in his young eyes. A slow, hesitant smile spread across Darius's face. I'm glad to hear that, officer, he said, his voice quiet but firm. He wasn't sure what the future held, but in that moment, under the fading light of a Virginia evening, he felt a flicker of hope, a fragile ember in the darkness. He knew the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But maybe, just maybe, something was shifting. Maybe, in the heart of this small town, a seed of real change had finally been planted. The fight for justice, for accountability, was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Darius allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, it was a fight they could win. The late May air hung heavy with the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint perfume of roses placed carefully at the foot of the war memorial. Darius adjusted his tie, the knot feeling too tight, constricting. He wasn't used to wearing suits. His desert boots, polished to a high shine, felt alien on the paved plaza. He preferred the yielding give of earth beneath his feet, the familiar crunch of gravel. This formality, the hushed reverence of the crowd, the fluttering flags, it all felt a world away from the raw, visceral reality he'd known overseas. And yet, another kind of battle had been fought here on this very ground, in his own neighborhood. He glanced at the small, almost imperceptible scar on his wrist, a lingering reminder of the cold bite of steel handcuffs. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on him, a palpable pressure against his skin. The murmurs rippled through the crowd, some whispers of support, others tinged with a curiosity that bordered on morbid fascination. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He'd faced down enemy fire, navigated treacherous terrain, yet standing here, before his own community, felt infinitely more daunting. They see the uniform, the medals, the carefully constructed image of a hero, he thought, his stomach clenching. But do they see me? Do they see the fear that still clawed at him in the dead of night, the lingering anger that simmered beneath the surface, the quiet despair that threatened to consume him? The mayor finished his introductory remarks, his voice echoing across the plaza, a litany of patriotic platitudes that seemed to hang in the air, detached and hollow. Darius's name was announced, and a ripple of applause broke the silence. He stepped forward, each footfall echoing in the sudden hush. He reached the podium, his hand gripping the cool metal, grounding himself. He looked out at the sea of faces, searching for a familiar anchor amidst the anonymity of the crowd. He saw Mrs. Garner, her silver hair gleaming in the sunlight, a small, determined smile on her lips. Her presence, her unwavering support, was a lifeline in this ocean of uncertainty. He took a deep breath, the scent of roses filling his lungs, a fragile reminder of beauty amidst the harsh realities of the world. When I was overseas, he began, his voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in his chest. We had a saying, "We fight for the guy next to us." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, allowing them to sink into the collective consciousness of the crowd. We look out for each other. We protect each other. We have each other's backs. That doesn't stop when we come home. His voice gained strength, fueled by the embers of a righteous anger. You don't get to call us heroes on Monday and profile us on Tuesday. The words resonated, sharp and clear, cutting through the ceremonial veneer. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd, this time louder, more charged. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the palpable tension in the air. Some faces hardened, their expressions shuddered. Others nodded in agreement, their eyes alight with a flicker of understanding. He knew he was treading dangerous ground, challenging the unspoken truths, the carefully constructed narratives that held their community together, but he couldn't stay silent. He'd fought for his country, faced death head-on, and he wouldn't be silenced by fear, by social pressure, by the ingrained prejudices that threatened to tear his community apart. "I swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the crowd, meeting each gaze with unwavering intensity. "And that oath doesn't expire when I take off the uniform. It applies here in our neighborhoods, in our everyday lives." He thought of the fear he'd felt that day, the cold, impersonal grip of the handcuffs, the weight of injustice pressing down on him. He thought of Trevor, his lawyer, his friend, who had guided him through the labyrinthine legal system, who had fought for him not just as a client, but as a fellow veteran, as a brother in arms. He thought of General Ellison, the unexpected ally, whose presence had sent shockwaves through the system, forcing them to confront their own biases, their own failings. "We need to do better," Darius said, his voice softening, tinged with a note of weary hope. "We need to be better. We need to see each other, truly see each other, beyond the color of our skin, beyond the labels we assign, beyond the assumptions we make. We need to remember that we are all part of the same community, the same nation. We are all Americans." He paused, his gaze settling on Mrs. Garner, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Her silent support, her unwavering belief in him, gave him the strength to finish. "We need to fight for the guy next to us, not just on the battlefield, but right here at home." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the nearby trees and the distant hum of traffic. Then, slowly, tentatively, applause began to ripple through the crowd, gathering momentum, growing louder, until it swelled into a roar of approval. He felt a wave of relief wash over him, a sense of release, of catharsis. He had spoken his truth, and it had been heard. He had taken the first step, a small step perhaps, but a crucial one, on a long and arduous journey towards healing, towards reconciliation, towards a future where justice and equality were not just ideals, but a lived reality. He knew the fight wasn't over, that there were still battles to be fought, but he also knew, deep in his heart, that he wasn't alone. He had his community, his friends, his allies. He had the memory of those who had fallen, those who had fought and died for the ideals he now championed. He had the unwavering support of Mrs. Garner, a quiet strength that resonated with a power that surprised even himself. And in that moment, standing on the hallowed ground of the war memorial, surrounded by the echoes of the past and the whispers of the future, he felt a flicker of hope, a fragile ember of belief that maybe, just maybe, they could build a better world, a world worthy of the sacrifices that had been made. The crisp scent of autumn leaves, tinged with the metallic bite of recent rain, hung heavy in the air. Darius inhaled deeply, the coolness a stark contrast to the heat that had choked him on the day it all began. The ceremony was over. The speeches echoed only in the whispers of departing crowds, but the weight of them, the weight of the moment, settled deep within his bones. He ran a hand over the newly planted sapling, its slender trunk a fragile promise against the vast backdrop of the park. A memorial tree, they'd called it, a symbol of growth, of change. He found himself wondering if it would truly take root, if it would survive the harsh winters to come. Just like the seeds of justice they'd sown, the sapling needed nurturing, constant vigilance against the weeds of apathy and indifference. A hand clasped his shoulder. It was Trevor, his lawyer, the man who had navigated him through the turbulent waters of the legal system, the man who had seen the rage simmering beneath Darius's forced composure. "It's a start, Darius." Trevor's voice, usually sharp and precise in the courtroom, was now softened with a weariness that mirrored his own. Darius nodded, his throat tight. He knew it was a start. The police department's revised policies, the officer retraining programs, the community dialogues all were steps in the right direction. But what nagged at him, a persistent hum beneath the surface of relief, was the knowledge that the journey was far from over. The tree, the policies, the speeches, they were all outward symbols. The real change, the deep-seated shift in perception and behavior, that was the arduous climb. He thought of Mrs. Garner, her frail frame trembling as she'd testified, her voice cracking as she'd recounted the absurdity of it all. The fear in her eyes hadn't been just for him, but for the fractured reality where a black man in uniform could be perceived as a threat simply because of the color of his skin. The following weeks were a blur of meetings, interviews, and community outreach programs. Darius found himself thrust into a role he hadn't sought, a reluctant spokesperson for a cause that should never have needed one. He spoke to high school students, their faces a mixture of bewilderment and dawning understanding. He shared his story with veteran groups, the silent nods of shared experience speaking volumes. Each interaction, each shared gaze, chipped away at the isolation he'd felt, replacing it with a tentative sense of shared purpose. He saw the same fear he'd felt reflected in the eyes of young black boys, the same weary resignation in the faces of their mothers. He listened to their stories, stories that echoed his own, stories that whispered of a deep-seated wound that ran through the fabric of their lives. He heard their silent pleas, their unspoken question, when will it end? One evening, he found himself in a small community center, surrounded by a group of young veterans. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the bitter tang of cheap coffee. One young man, his arm in a sling, his face scarred, spoke of the nightmares that haunted him, not from the battlefield, but from the casual racism he encountered back home. "I risked my life for this country," he'd said, his voice raw with pain, "and I come back to this disrespect. Like my service doesn't count." Darius looked at him, saw the reflection of his own struggle in the young man's haunted eyes. He knew what it felt like to have your sacrifice reduced to the color of your skin. He knew what it meant to feel like a stranger in your own land. He didn't offer platitudes or empty promises. Instead, he shared his story, not just the incident itself, but the aftermath, the struggle, the slow, agonizing process of finding his voice. "It's not easy," he'd told them, his voice low and steady, "but we have to keep fighting. We have to keep reminding them that our skin doesn't cancel out our service." The faces around him, initially hardened with cynicism, softened, a flicker of hope igniting in their eyes. In that dimly lit room, surrounded by the ghosts of shared trauma, Darius felt a shift within himself. The burden of his experience, once a crushing weight, began to feel like a call to action. He realized that his story, though born from pain and injustice, held the power to inspire change. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a testament to the power of speaking truth to power. The days bled into weeks, the weeks into months. The media frenzy subsided. The headlines faded, but the quiet work continued. Darius became a mentor, a counselor, a beacon of hope for those who felt marginalized and forgotten. He learned that true leadership wasn't about grand gestures or soaring speeches, but about the everyday acts of courage, the willingness to listen, to empathize, to stand in solidarity with those whose voices have been silenced for too long. He knew the fight for justice wasn't a sprint, but a marathon. There would be setbacks, there would be moments of despair, but he also knew that the seeds of change, once planted, had a way of taking root, even in the most barren of landscapes. He looked back at the sapling in the park, its branches reaching towards the sky, a fragile but enduring symbol of hope. He thought of the countless others who had walked the same path, who had fought the same battles, who had dared to dream of a world where justice wasn't a privilege but a right. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, a single thought echoed in his mind, a thought that had become his mantra, his guiding principle, his unwavering belief. Your skin shouldn't cancel out your service, your silence shouldn't be the cost of your safety. We don't just owe our veterans respect. We owe them fairness.